It's time for the strange and scary mysteries of the month for July 2022, and today we have a solid one for you to check out. We have the story of some Army vets being told to keep their mouths shut about some otherworldly encounters they had in the desert. Then a pretty insane story about a man who spent 3 decades in prison for a crime he didn't commit. We'll also hear of a recent confession from a killer who murdered many years ago and then led authorities to the victim's remains. A man who spoke to God and was commanded to kill not just anybody, but his wife. And then we'll wrap it all up by checking out some of the news coming out of the recent Congress hearings on UFOs. If you're a fan of this channel and enjoy the content we're putting out, then go ahead and subscribe, like, and comment so that we can continue to grow. Thank you all so much for all the comments already. It's been fun talking with you recently, and thanks for tuning in. Now here are the strange and scary mysteries of the month for July 2022. Number 5. Army vets ordered silence. The Sinai Peninsula has long been a hotbed of conflict between Egypt and Israel. Bloody wars have been waged here with the goal of gaining control of the region, but apparently it's not only about territorial disputes that make this place so interesting. As it so happens, some things have occurred here that are simply unexplainable. In December of 2014, 3 members of the 3rd Cavalry of the U.S. Army joined forces with their international counterparts in a multinational force and observers, or an MFO, mission. Their primary objective was to watch for any potential military activity from either the Egyptian or Israeli side of the peninsula. One night, Private First Class Dovell Ingram was watching from a guard tower when he spotted a bright aircraft of some sort cruising across the sky. What he observed prompted him to call his sergeant, Travis Bingham. Like Ingram, the Texas-born native was totally unprepared for what he had seen. In a statement, the military officer said that it looked like a big object being swarmed with several smaller objects. They appeared to be communicating with one another and moving like they were having a dogfight. But what baffled them more was the way they moved. Like flies buzzing around, they zipped to and from at such extreme speeds not achievable by current human technology. Ingram and Bingham then called E4 specialist Vishal Singh, who shared the same bewilderment as the other 2 men. But the spectacle didn't end there. Now joined by their other military cohorts, the 3 U.S. military personnel saw the small drones merging into what they now thought of as a mothership. Once they were all gathered, it shrunk smaller and smaller until eventually the aircraft disappeared entirely. Shaken and stunned, the trio was left with a dilemma. How are they going to report this rather perplexing incident to the higher-ups? And will those officers believe them for what they were about to say? Out of fear, the men decided to keep what they saw to themselves. And they did so for the reason that if they let the information out, they could be ordered to undergo psychological evaluations. They know for sure that if they did so, this would probably mean the end of their careers. One of their senior officers told them to keep their mouths shut, and they did so willingly. That is, until recently in 2021, when the U.S. Congress passed a bill mandating the creation of a new office that would seek to investigate what they officially call unidentified aerial phenomena. And this time around, they divulged the details, and indeed, it baffled everyone. But still, up to this day, no one could put a logical explanation as to what exactly happened that one night in Sinai. Number 4. Wrongfully imprisoned for 3 decades. Mistakes happen from time to time. Even the so-called professionals do commit blunders in their respective fields, like a cook adding the wrong ingredient, or a hairstylist cutting a client's hair too short. At least these errors aren't too serious, at least not enough to have a drastic effect in our lives. But there are some things that we can't afford to make a misstep on, like a surgeon cutting the wrong nerve, a pilot forgetting his drill, or a judge sentencing the innocent. On January 17, 1990, two men entered an apartment in the Coconut Grove section of Miami, Florida. Their intent was only to rob the place of its valuables, but the operation went wrong and ended with the shooting of Frances McKinnon. It so happened that the victim's stepdaughter, Dorothy Walton, was there at the scene and had reportedly seen a robber pull the trigger. During the investigation, police received a tip that the gunman was somebody named Thomas James, or Tommy James. Photos of individuals with criminal records were then put up for Walton to identify. At this time, she positively identified a man named Thomas Raynard James. With a matching name and a positive identification from the lone witness, James, who was 23 at the time, was then arrested for the crime. Although prosecutors could not tie up the accused to any physical or circumstantial evidence, he was put on trial nonetheless and eventually convicted of first-degree murder. After that, he was sentenced to life in prison in 1991. For anyone in his position, he or she would file an appeal that the conviction be reconsidered. James did so incessantly for many years, and his family, friends, and relatives knew that, though he may have problems with the law, he was a pot dealer at the time, and he would never take somebody's life. So for more than 30 years, his appeals were ignored repeatedly, and that is until July of 2021, when a writer for a magazine decided to investigate James's supposedly wrongful conviction. The piece subsequently caught the attention of legal prosecutors, who in turn looked into the case. Fast forward to 2022, the office of the Miami-Dade State Attorneys highlighted on the issue of eyewitness identification. In a new trial, Miss Walton was once again asked to testify if indeed it was James whom she saw back in 1991. And it was a huge wave of relief, at least for the convict, to hear from the witness saying that she now believes she made a mistake. With this, James, who was now 55 years old, was released in April of 2022 for what the court regarded as a case of mistaken identity. Despite his clear victory, the truth remains that whoever killed McKinnon in 1991 has evaded the law and made James pay for a crime that he didn't commit in the first place, and ultimately ruined his life. Number 3. 2009 killing of Brittany Drexel. It's a saying as old as time that mother knows best. Though they may have some shortcomings, we still hold this belief that the first woman in our lives has nothing else in mind but to look after our well-being. And there are many stories of a mother's instinct telling them when their child is in trouble. There's no real way to explain it, they just feel it. Dawn Drexel is one of those mothers who had a sinking feeling that something wasn't right about her daughter, Brittany, when she went to Myrtle Beach in South Carolina to spend her spring break in 2009. The fact that the 17-year-old's group didn't have an accompanying adult made the mother more wary of her child traveling. Despite the parents protesting, the teenager went anyway and left her home in chilly New York. On April 25, 2009, the young girl was then reported missing. Her case ended up in national headlines. You can only imagine the huge shock it brought to the Drexel family. And what's worse is that because of the lack of leads and information, her missing persons case eventually went cold. So for 13 long years, Brittany's parents lived in a state of uncertainty while hoping that their daughter was still alive out there somewhere. However, now their fears have finally materialized. Because in May of 2022, law enforcement officials announced that they had found human remains during a search in a wooded area on Old Town Avenue, close to Harmony Township in Pennsylvania. An examination of dental records led authorities to confirm that the remains belonged to the missing teen from New York. All this rather shocking information as to where she was came from a person who the Georgetown County Sheriff's Office had arrested just days earlier. His name was Raymond Moody. Now 62, Moody was actually a suspect in Drexel's disappearance during its early investigation. Surprisingly, though, the lack of circumstantial evidence got him off the hook at the time. In April of 2022, a South Carolina man was arrested on an obstruction of justice charge, and during his detention, Moody reportedly confessed to a brutal crime. As stated in the arrest affidavit, the suspect allegedly kidnapped and sexually assaulted the victim and then killed her by using manual strangulation. Since this is now a renewed investigation, Georgetown County Police couldn't divulge further details of the case, including how the crime happened and where exactly it occurred. Police considered this update a bittersweet development, though Mr. and Mrs. Drexel's hope of seeing their daughter alive was finally quelled. At least they get the closure that they so deserved for more than a decade. Number 2, God told him to kill his wife. In the Bible, the Lord said in His commandments, "Thou shalt not kill." And yet, there have been a lot of individuals who have claimed to be bound by His divine words, caught doing a lot of killing. For some, it was deep-rooted religious fanaticism that pushed them to do the unthinkable, but for others, killing in the name of God could just be pure insanity. On May 16, 2022, police were called to an apartment in Lawrence, Kansas. The caller was Chad Merrick, who dialed 911 and asked for emergency assistance. Upon their arrival, responders found Regan Gibbs, Merrick's wife. The 25-year-old was found to be mortally wounded and appeared unresponsive. Gibbs, a native of Natchez, Washington, served as a goalkeeper for the University of Kansas Jayhawks soccer team from 2015 to 2018. During those years, she became a member of 2 NCAA tournaments. The medical responders announced that the athlete died there on the spot. Consequently, Merrick was then arrested under suspicion of domestic abuse. A representative for the Lawrence County Police said that the victim's cause of death was brought about by numerous injuries she incurred. An investigation was conducted, including an autopsy, but the findings have yet to be disclosed since this is still an ongoing case. Merrick attempted to justify the killing by telling police that he had only been following God's instructions. As to what these instructions were exactly, they weren't revealed. But suffice to say, it may have been something in the line of hurting his wife, given how the latter suffered at his hands. Now detained for first-degree murder charges, Merrick is currently being held on a $1 million bail. This wouldn't be the first time that the accused had a run-in with the law, because prior to this tragic incident, the suspect had convictions for violence, interfering with medical emergency personnel, and law enforcement procedures. There are so many questions around this case. Was Gibbs truly a victim of domestic abuse? Did something happen between them that instigated the violence, or was Merrick really commanded by the divine to allegedly kill his wife? Needless to say, in time, hopefully we'll get some answers. Number 1. U.S. Congress UFO Hearings. For generations, the public has been fascinated about flying saucers, orbs glowing in the sky, and aircrafts that are otherworldly in form and function. Left on our own, we resort to coming up with theories that we perceive to be logical, but unknowingly, the government has also been hard at work trying to make sense of these mysteries. In 1966, the U.S. Congress conducted a public hearing into the issue of UFO sightings around the country. The convention came to be when the nation was rocked over the report of UFO appearances in Michigan. Witnesses numbered around 40 individuals, and that included a dozen policemen. 3 years after that, the Air Force launched UFO investigations that they called Project Blue Book. It was followed several decades later with countless similar hearings, So far, the U.S. National Intelligence and even the Pentagon would always seem to fall short on giving sound explanations regarding the matter. There will always be occurrences that cannot and will never be accounted for due to its baffling nature. The same kind of bewilderment was carried over in May of 2022 when the U.S. government once again conducted another public hearing. This time, though, the inquiry revolved around military encounters with what we now officially call UAPs. Heading the proceedings was the House Intelligence Committee on Counterterrorism, Counterintelligence, and Counterproliferation, who interviewed officials from the Airborne Object Identification and Management Synchronization Group, or AOI-MSG. AOI-MSG was created with the aim of looking into the various reports made by U.S. Navy pilots and their constituents. These service members reportedly had encounters with UAPs over the past several years. Meanwhile, the agency collected roughly 400 reports of UAP sightings happening not only in the country but abroad as well. During the hearing, the committee was able to characterize and identify these events into several distinct categories like airborne clutters, natural atmospheric phenomena, U.S. government development programs, as well as foreign systems. However, there's one category that inadvertently captured the imaginations of many, and they call it the other. As indicated, these are simply cases that they have yet to make sense of. One example of which is the 2004 incident in which U.S. fighter pilots encountered an object on the Pacific that rapidly descended tens of thousands of feet from the sky before abruptly stopping and hovering above the water's surface. The footage taken showed that the vessel didn't make a single ripple, despite its neck breaking downward velocity. During the proceeding, a video was also presented to the public for the first time, showing a U.S. Navy fighter jet. In it, suddenly an object of unknown origins flew past above its head. It was weird to say the least, and the pilots who have reportedly come in close contact with the UAP couldn't identify what it was. Intelligence officers and analysts who reviewed the material share the same confusion as well, and so, today, the object still remains unidentified. To make matters even more intriguing, not once, ever since these UFO sightings reportedly started, have authorities been able to gather even just a sample piece of material from these so-called extraterrestrial objects. Moreover, not one U.S. service member has recorded a collision or made direct communication with the UAP. Meanwhile, the Pentagon maintained that one of their primary motives to investigate UAPs largely concerns national security. Speaking in this context, officials said that the government should always be wary of any possible technological advancements achieved by our counterparts like China and Russia. After the hearing, which lasted for a couple hours, the committee reportedly closed its doors for what they called a private classified conference with just lawmakers in attendance. For whatever things they discussed secretly, we can only assume that the slate of information provided was something they thought the general public couldn't possibly comprehend. But no matter what the truth is, I think the world certainly deserves to know. Thanks so much for tuning in. Check out some of our other strange and scary mysteries over here on the right. And remember, you can always listen to these episodes over on the Scary Mysteries podcast, available all over the place.